there are suttas where wanderers of other sects also teach the 5 hindrances. But when asked about the difference between their teaching and the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha replies that if those wanderers of other sects were asked if there is a way of exposition by which the 5 hindrances become 10, then they would not know how to answer and become all confused.
Mm-hmm.
The Buddha then goes on to teach how the 5 hindrances become 10.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, whatever sensual desire there is for the internal is a hindrance, and whatever sensual desire there is for the external is also a hindrance.
Mm-hmm.
Same for ill will. Can we discuss what is meant by internal and external here?
Mm-hmm. So, I think the most practical, basically, way to for somebody to wrap their head around it would be external is regarding the sense objects. But that also means your thoughts concerned about sense objects would be external. And then internal, again, practically speaking, say you could discern the internal. You can't just turn your senses or your attention towards it, because that's not, it never appears as an object of your senses. I mean, you could say, well, internal it's the sense basis and so on, but it's like, what is a sense basis, practically speaking? How do you look for them when you can't see them directly? Your eye cannot see itself. It can only see the sights. And if for whatever reason your eye sees the organ of itself in the mirror, it sees the sight of it, does not see itself seeing it. So the only way to discern the internal, it's that kind of, as we often say, indirect way through that, like a peripheral recognition, or like even like a self-awareness, like awareness of yourself in a situation. That's already a form of experiencing the internal counterpart. So instead of you just being absorbed with the senses, you see yourself or discern yourself being absorbed with the sense objects. Sorry, not senses. So instead of being absorbed with the sense objects, you see yourself being absorbed with the sense objects. That second experience is like revealing the internal counterpart. So then you could have, and sensuality obviously permeates both. Sensuality is manifested through chasing the sense objects, but fundamentally, both perspectives that can be simultaneously present, your kind of focus on a sense object, but then recognizing yourself being absorbed with the sense objects, both of those perspectives can be concurrent, and they are concurrent. It's just that you don't necessarily discern them both, but they're both within the domain of sensuality. So they would be both affected with ill will, or with the possibility of ill will. So then it's not enough to just say no to sense objects, for example, that you are sensually sort of craving for, but you need to sufficiently also see yourself in the situation of craving for sense objects, and then overcome the passion towards that situation of the reflexive kind. And that's what the Buddha was describing in the suttas, like, you need to be physically withdrawn from the sensuality. But if your mind is also not dried up from it, you're not overcoming it. And that's what means drying up your mind. So, like, you can, as I said, say you see something pleasant, something desirable, and desire is present. If you just obviously act out of it and pursue it, there is no concurrent recognition of that other internal perspective. There is just continuation of the loss of perspective and going down the rabbit hole until kind of it runs out, options disappear, evaporate, and then you might kind of wake up afterwards. You scratch your itch so hard and then it stops itching, and then it's like, oh, where am I? What happened? Type of thing. You kind of come out of that haze of being kind of pulled further into sensuality because you gave in. So if you're not, say, automatically doing that, but are still staying on the level of, okay, this is the beautiful sight that is trying to pressure me, I'll say no to it, I'll say no to it, I'll say no to it. Or let me think something else, let me look at something else, let me look at the ugly to remove it, let me do this, let me do that. Either way, you're still not self-aware of the experience as a whole. So the internal dimension is still not revealed. It's still not discerned. And that's why I keep saying to people, the practice of asubha that the suttas describe, or practice of metta, applies to somebody, a sotapanna basically, who already sees the internal sufficiently to the point he has discerned chitta. Because chitta can only be discerned further internally, so to speak. Otherwise, if you just think when you see beautiful, look at the ugly, when you think bad, think positive, you see, either way you remain engaged with the sense objects and its oppositions, but you don't see yourself being engaged with the sense objects. That is not permitted to arise because obviously your view is still locked onto sense object as the problem. But that's not where the sensuality comes from. So you could be countering sense objects with your ugly sense objects, but even that's not the actual practice of asubha. Asubha is when there is a sense object that pressuring the mind with the desire. You recognize the experience as a whole. There is he, as the Satipatthana, he knows the mind of lust as mind of lust. So he knows there is a mind infected with lust towards this, and that's what I see, the whole thing. And now while the whole thing is there, I can also provide the mind on the basis of the whole thing. I can provide it with that very thing that you are infatuated with, body or other tastes or sounds and so on, is dangerous, carries disgust in and of itself. So now you are rewriting the context of the involvement of desire. You're not just trying to deny it and replace it. And that can only be done, that rewriting can only be done internally, on the basis of internal. So if you are just dealing with the external stuff, you're not overcoming a hindrance. But if through obvious necessary restraint towards the external, you do not just blindly try to deny when the mind is affected with lust or ill will or doubt, but you recognize, instead of that, you recognize the experience as a whole of mind infected towards this, mind affected towards that. And you cultivate that recognition instead of just giving in either through just acting out or trying to deny it. And that's how you develop internal sense bases sufficiently enough so when then both are included. So when all you can see is your mind having a desire towards this sight or that sound or any object, where that's your starting point, means you would have overcome the view of sensuality, the assumption of sensuality. Now you just see the mind wanting or not wanting, but you're completely disowning the whole thing because it has been discerned as, oh, I'm not doing this. I were never doing this. Even these desires that I thought were mine were never mine. I just did not see the internal framework because I've been preoccupied of just acting towards sense objects out of the immediate pressure, either through affirming it or denying it. Either way, I was not looking internally. So that's why the beginning of that internal recognition is self-awareness, like in any situation, in any experience, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And that's why I always say, like, in the beginning, you have to endure things rightly to get to see that, hold on, it's not about getting rid of stuff in the way I thought it was, just counter it, just do the opposite. Because you're still doing that equally lacking awareness of that internal counterpart. No, it's about including everything. So first, if you habitually stop giving towards it, like immediately jumping at whatever you're pressured towards, if you just immediately go for it, well, that's a problem. Whatever you're pressured towards, you don't immediately go for it, but you try to now get rid of that experience as a whole. Again, you're trying to get rid of that, the basis where the internal can be discerned. So if you don't give in blindly, but you don't try to get rid of what has arisen, but instead recognize it as the wholeness of your situation. Because that is a fact. Like, oh, there's a desire towards this. I said no, because I learned, I heard it, I need to restrain myself first. Now what? Like, do I now believe that just through saying no, 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 mind will magically tame itself and free itself from sensuality? No. So what do? Well, I recognize the experience as a whole of me being pressured by desire towards this or that, saying no to it, feeling uncomfortable on account of it, and now resisting that discomfort with aversion. Because that's what you would see if you don't blindly give in and don't try to get rid of it. You will recognize, okay, whether I like it or not, I am in the situation of such and such kind, which is the situation I just described. I'm trying to overcome this discomfort. I used to try and overcome it by giving in to sense desires. Then I was told that's bad. Then I was trying to overcome it by doing this suba, by doing this, by doing that. Either way, I'm averse to it. Why am I averse to it? I'm not doing it. The mind is gripped, but why do I take for granted the aversion that it provides for me? So that's how you actually overcome hindrances internally and externally. But if you are just seeing them or assuming them to be on the level of external sense objects, you're not overcoming anything. Those are not even hindrances correctly. So through practice of self-awareness, whether you're trying to go with your desire or say no or try to get rid of it because it's unpleasant, first and foremost, you need to be self-aware of whatever the experience is. And then factually recognize, okay, yeah, mind, chitta is still liable towards these pressures, towards these pulls. But I can't just force it to drop it, force the mind to just give it up. But what I can do is never lose perspective in regard to that whole thing. So again, Satipatthana says, he knows the mind of lust as the mind of lust. Does not say, when mind of lust, he does this and he makes it into a mind of non-lust. No. You will make it into a mind of non-lust by knowing it as a lustful mind. That's how you will subdue it and calm it down. Because if you try to act out of the mind of lust, any act you do will be infected with lust. If you try to act out of mind of ill will, anything you do, even practice of metta, will be driven by that ill will. So he knows the mind of lust as mind of lust. Self-aware to the extent of recognizing the chitta for what it is, and then not losing the sight of that until it calms down. So that's where the patient endurance, khanti, comes in. Otherwise, you'll be just doing it on your terms. In other words, otherwise you'll be just doing it out of your own desire.
And the same applies to the hindrance of doubt.
Oh yeah. I think doubt is probably going to be the first one that's kind of the most obvious. If you can abandon, if you can practice correctly towards the hindrance of doubt internally and externally, you will overcome the view, the fetter of doubt. So you still might have doubt manifest internally or externally, but you would not be established upon a view that the doubt comes from the external counterparts. And a person might say, well, I don't think that. But the fact is, just ask yourself, when there is a doubtful mind, do you immediately go and start revolving around fixing it, resolving the doubt, finding the answers? That means you still carry the view that the answers come from the outside. That's why it's like people can't even follow their own reasoning, their own intellect, even when it's accurate, because it doesn't carry as much weight for them, that knowledge, as opposed to knowledge of some authority externally saying what's right, what's wrong. Or sometimes people can't even, people know what they should do internally, through their own intellect and reasoning and understanding, but they can't do it until somebody externally says, even if it's the same thing that somebody externally tells them, that's the way where they can do it. Because the view has placed the emphasis that the resolution of this doubt, of this pressure, discomfort, dissonance that doesn't feel right, comes through finding the external clarity. and external means of affirmation of what I need to do, what I need to practice, and so on. Initially, everybody will start like that, but the point will come where you will know that I know enough in a sense of information and learning, but what I'm doing now is like whenever the mind pressures me with doubt, I take it for granted that I must get rid of this. I must resolve this. So I go back and I reread the text and I ask more questions and I do this. Or I change up and I find something else. Something to just appease this mind externally, which is no different than finding sense objects, pursuing sense objects to appease the mental craving, the chitta's craving towards sense desire, through sense desire. So that's why, like, if you actually don't give in to the pressure of doubt and stay with it, and instead of, but I must resolve this because I'm not sure about it, instead of, no, I will resolve it when there is no more pressure to resolve it. Then I might choose to resolve it if there is a genuine lack of information I'm not sure about. But for as long as there is this compulsion to resolve it, that it's unpleasant, I will be fueling the hindrance of doubt, which means I will be maintaining the fetter of the doubt that I'm fettered by. In other words, placing the emphasis that doubt comes from the lack of clarity from external things. So if you don't act out of doubt long enough, endure the mental pressure and be self-aware of it instead of trying to resolve it, the emphasis will lessen and eventually it would shift. And you will realize that the doubt comes from doubtful chitta that has encountered things suitable for doubt, as the Suttas would say. But the doubt never came from the actual objects that you've been perceiving or thinking about. Same with sensuality. In so many suttas they would have said, no, beautiful things remain in the world. They're not sensuality. It was the man's internal desire and lust, basically, his thoughts affected with that wrong emphasis. That's what his sensuality is. The wise one who removes that desire and lust, beautiful things remain standing unchanged. They never were the origin of the problem. It was the untrained chitta.
And that is why the Sotapanna is described as both being confident and at the same time independent of others.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, he has seen chitta sufficiently enough on that internal basis that he cannot fall back into that wrong emphasis that the clarity comes from the clarity of the form or duty or virtue or performing the precepts or external authority. Just that's just cut off. That whole belief is just cut off, gone, cannot come back. Because the sole reason for the existence of that entire sphere of those first three fetters was not seeing the chitta as the sole reason for all these problems, for the craving, for the dukkha, and so on. Now, once he sees it, he won't be mistaking it elsewhere, but okay, now he needs to train that, and that's the whole training described in the suttas. That's why almost always when the Buddha outlined practice of not almost always, every single time when the Buddha outlined the practice of asubha or metta, different perceptions, even that one kind of contemplating the asubha or jhana, it was always in reference to a noble disciple that already knows what the path is, already been doing it. Because now when he does the asubha, when he does the metta, he's doing it aiming at the chitta. He's doing it rightly. He's not doing it just as a reaction to what he feels oppresses him on account of saying no to blindly following the desire and acting out. And that's the middle way. And that's why the middle way sounds simple, yet it's the hardest thing to see. Like if the Buddha's teaching would have been the way the modern Theravada is presenting it, just counter the perceptions, anybody can do it. Doesn't matter whether you're keeping the precepts or not. When this, just think that. When that, just think this. It's like, well, the Buddha would have said so. He would not have been talking about the chitta and the trainee and the signs of the mind and the necessary factors for development and the virtue and restraint, seclusion, withdrawal, for these things to even become possible to be seen. He would just said, no, monks, when it's this, just look at that. When it's that, just look at this. When this bothers you, recite this mantra. When that bothers you, recite that mantra. No, that's just perversion and bastardization, pretty much, by people that haven't seen that middle ground, and all they see is just what's written there, and it's kind of flattened, and it just sounds like, okay, so when it's A, I do the B. When it's B, if B bothers me, I go back to A, and I just do that long enough until poof. the mind just enlightens itself. But like, how can you do jhana if you're not fully withdrawn from sensuality? Because every single description in the sutta starts by being fully withdrawn from sensuality as a prerequisite for jhana. The pleasure of jhana comes from not because of a mystical experience or meditation, but comes from being safe from the dangerous domain of sensuality and recognizing that. How can you do metta if you don't see your own chitta being sufficiently enough seeing it? Not just like, oh yeah, my chitta is now like this. No, are you seeing it as an independent entity inseparable from you? Are you seeing mind affected with ill will as mind affected with ill will? And are you okay with that? In other words, are you able to contain that mind affected with ill will? Or are you, okay, but now let me do metta. Why? Because you're averse to the mind affected with ill will because it feels uncomfortable, feels threatening, feels unpleasant. Same with sensuality. That's what I'm saying, people. Like, you need to start restraining, because basically, for as long as you don't cultivate that restraint sufficiently enough, whether you want it or not, whether you think about it or not, you will believe, you will genuinely exist in the form of belief that sensuality and desire comes from sense objects. And then when you say no to that, the pain that comes as a result of it, you think it came because I said no. But if you actually stop giving in to sensuality, regardless of what you believe, stop fueling it, the time will come when you recognize. In other words, if you practice renunciation long enough, you'll see that not just that the renunciation doesn't cause the pain of that you experience when you say no to something, it reveals it as something that was already there. So the pain that you experience when you say no to your desires came from the desires. Saying no just highlighted it. But for somebody with a completely skewed view of where the emphasis is, sense objects, good, bad, just linear plus minus, do not allow self-awareness in regard to either. Means you're not allowing the mind to be seen and discerned, which is a prerequisite for Sotapanna. Which means everything else that the Buddha taught to Sotapanna simply does not apply to you.
And so you mentioned the three fetters in relation to now discerning the chitta rightly. But how does personality view fit into that?
It's same. The extent of the emphasis on the external. That's exactly what Attavada is. It's the view that your kind of, say, the center of your being, the center of who you are, the center of I am, the center of my point of view, it's external to this experience as a whole. In the same sense, the sensuality is external to these desires, to these cravings, to these actions. That's why by addressing the wrong emphasis that has proliferated into the assumption of it comes from over there, all these things will disappear. These first three fetters, because that was the basis for all three of them.